Welcome to the first episode of the American Sociological Association's Comparative Historical Sociology podcast series. I'm Katrina, and I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Professor Charles Kurzman from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Kurzman has worked for many years in comparative historical sociology, known for his work on Islamic movements, democratization, and political revolutions. His research challenges conventional narratives on extremism, democracy, and intellectual movements, with influential books such as The Unthinkable Revolution in Iran, Democracy Denied, 1905 to 1915, Intellectuals and the Fate of Democracy, The Missing Martyrs, Why Are There So Few Muslim Terrorists?
Hi, everyone. My name is Claire. And just to follow up on what Katrina just said, beyond Professor Kurzman's work on these topics, he has contributed significantly to the rethinking of comparative methods in social science and the incorporation of colonialism and imperialism as the central issues in comparative historical sociology. In today's conversation, Professor Kurzman will share his insights and enthusiasm for the ongoing developments in these two areas. So let's get started.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be talking with you both.
All right, just to get us started, I know that Professor Kurzman just recently published this article titled The Strange Career of Millian Methods in Comparative Social Science. Very exciting work. And in this article, you ask whether the Millian method should be understood as a method or a craft. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this distinction and how it might help us rethink comparative methods more broadly.
Oh, thank you. For people who might be listening who haven't read the article or who would like the very quick summary instead of having to read the article, this is a piece that traces the history of these comparative methods developed by John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century that are very frequently referred to today as important rules to live by in the pursuit of case-based comparative studies in the social science, despite the fact that John Stuart Mill himself said one should never use these methods in the study of the social sciences. Only he felt in the experimental natural sciences where you can control conditions. And the irony of that mismatch is so interesting, and how it has then affected the enterprise of comparative social science over the last half century, since Mill was, in his work, was rediscovered by comparativists in the 1970s. So you mentioned the word craft, and I think that is exactly right, Claire, that's where we're heading. That instead of viewing comparative social science as a series of methods that one has to, rules that one has to follow in order to do quality work, my sense is that the best practice is actually to view this research as craft. It's something for which there are no hard and fast rules, but one learns from people who do it well. What are the standards? What works? What convinces people? And that craftiness, craft-like aspect of this research is a huge strength. It's a flexibility, and it allows us to study things where the actual cases, the cases that are available to us, don't necessarily match the gold standard of experimental social science, which is often the case when you're studying historical cases.
You mentioned experimental social science. In experimental social sciences, we always talk about the treatment group. There is also a control group. So the comparative sense has already been embedded in experimental social science. It's also very interesting to think about how would comparative historical sociologists look experiment social science in historical studies, like in political science and economic history. So how would our field think about these kind of methods, like research discontinuity design? I know like you have a paper on that.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. These are huge debates going on throughout the social sciences. And, on the one hand, I think many of us can agree that experimental methods are extremely strong and precise for topics where one is able to find cases that match experimentally. Um, there's a huge question then of whether large-scale quantitative empirical data sets, to what extent do those mimic the logic of experimental social science? And many parts of political science and other fields are deciding that they're not really equivalent to experimental methods. But then when you're talking about case-based research, as we so often do in comparative historical sociology, finding perfectly matched quasi-experimental cases is really rare. And frequently the cases just are, that we're interested in on substantive questions that we're really interested in, those kinds of matches don't exist. So are we to stop studying those things because the conditions for experimental methods aren't there? Or do we do the best we can? And I think it's doing the best we can that is sort of the essence of a craft. And there's better and worse. There's more convincing and less convincing. But it's a different logic and a different pursuit, it seems to me, and a different sort of training, honestly, that takes longer than just learning the rules of experimentation or the rules of statistical analysis. And so I think comparative social science has a higher bar to meet in a way, even though the methods may seem squishy and less than perfectly rigorous to folks who are really wedded to experimental design.
Thank you. And I also think, how would you know what is a treatment or what is a control? Like, who belongs to the treatment group and who belongs to the control group? It seems to me, no, like I personally don't know. Like maybe people would think negative cases or positive cases might have a parallel to this treatment and control division. But in my opinion, like it's very hard to find a treatment in comparative historical science.
Yeah, that's deep, because you can always flip it around and say the treatment is the other thing. And I think that's true because, life as we know it is messy. All sorts of things are going on at once. So you never have these perfect conditions that an experimentalist might want. I think there's a sort of humorous footnote here in the word control, like a control group and controlled experimentation. Like there is, I don't know, is it some sort of Nietzschean will to power to control things in order to achieve knowledge? I kind of make fun of it, not to accuse anybody of anything, but there is something about the rest of the world, that cannot be controlled. It is uncontrollable. And I think that is the world as we find it, with many of the big questions that people are going after in comparative historical sociology.
I think that actually speaks to another question that I'm thinking about, where you're talking about how I personally find comparative historical methods, or in this case, craft, to be incredibly helpful in terms of helping us understand the broader global trends that are happening, and since that have been happening since the early development of this debate, decades ago. I also find thinking about comparative method not necessarily as a method, but rather as like a craft. That's more like that does not follow this fixed set of rules, but rather an ever evolving kind of standard that offers a little bit more flexibility in terms of helping us make better sense of the world. But in terms of, I know that, the world is, as we know today, there's a lot going on. And I think this definitely poses like a big challenge for comparative historical sociologists to kind of identify the causal mechanisms, to develop explanatory frameworks in order to really make sense of what is going on around the world today. So I'm just wondering how you think we can apply the idea of comparative historical method as a craft to explain what is happening around the world today. Like, how do we make sense of this concept? How could we possibly apply this concept today?
Well, Thank you, Claire. Making sense of the world today is a small task. We should be able to take care of that in the space of a short podcast. So to start in, I think I want to identify like several aspects of what you're getting at. One of them is this causal mechanism. Not all studies are causal, right? And not all have to be. But if we're interested in causal effects, how did we get here? There's all sorts of factors that could be involved. Identifying the ones we think are important is almost a theoretical issue before you even get to the beginnings of your case study, right? I mean, you could take the world inductively, but there'd be, and say, these are the things that seem to be important by throwing everything into the model. That would be sort of an inductive data science approach. Let's just take all the variables. But that has its own flaws, especially which kinds of information is available. And you have to go collect information, sometimes original information, because you think it's important, but it wasn't already collected. So there are theoretical issues. The Timmerman and Tavery approach of going back and forth between theory and method that they call abductive approaches, I think is what everybody actually does anyway. At least all the successful folks in social science do that anyway. So there's no easy solution to the problem of selecting cases, the problem of selecting issues, potential causal factors. There's yet another layer, though, what I want to get at, and that is global factors. When you say the current moment, on a global scale, the world is different now than it was 20 years ago or 200 years ago in ways that affect virtually everybody on the planet. And in those cases, there's variation, but it's also like the rise of the sea. I mean, it's a change that affects everybody. And the normal variable-based approach might not work in those situations. So you have whole traditions within the social sciences. And I'm thinking, for example, of world society approaches that say that it's not really about variation as much as about like the culture of the world itself, or the technological change that has affected the whole planet, or other sorts of major things. Those have their own methods too, their own approaches, because the standard way of looking for variation on key variables may not be the big picture. The big picture might be the whole range of variables has changed, or it's not even a variable. So I think that part of when we say, how can we explain the world today, that it opens up all of these series of interesting questions. There's one other aspect to follow up on this, Claire, that has to do with how did we get here? And that's the historical part. And I think that so much of social science looks at contemporary variation and doesn't examine the historical roots nearly as much as I would like to see. Comparative historical sociology, the historical is built in. It's part of the name. And I think that's so important. Now, the same kinds of data may not be available for historical periods than they are today. And we're limited by, if one is limited by the availability of data, then you're going to get a pretty shallow slice of history that you're looking at. If you want to go further, inevitably you're going to get into data problems, and you're going to have to relax your standards or open up your eyes to the new forms of evidence, whether it's archival or other sorts of evidence that will speak to these earlier periods. So if I could self-promotionally mention my current ongoing project about citizenship and the development of the global citizenship regime that we have today, which I think is really important for changes in global inequality. At least that's the argument that I'm pursuing here and trying to test empirically, including not just quantitative data, but also historical and qualitative material. The roots of that system that we live in today, where we just take for granted that everybody is a citizen of some country, and the governments of each country really have very little responsibility for people who are not their citizens, and especially people who are not their citizens who don't live inside their territory. That system is new. The whole idea of citizens is relatively new in the modern era. We can trace it, as I'm trying to do in this project. And the tracing it shows how it developed and certain choices were made along the way that helped to form the system that we take for granted today, that's hegemonic today, the citizenship regime. I call it the emergence of citizenship discrimination or citicism. And I think that the empirical approach for digging into this history inevitably is going to be in part persuasion that we're ultimately social science and all of academia is in a communications field. Like we're trying to communicate, we're trying to convince people of something. And whether that convincing takes the form of statistical regression analysis or whether it takes the form of narrative, ultimately that is our goal, is to convince people. And I think the methods are less important really than the content and the delivery. Like, do you do it well? Is it convincing? So I'd like to see us not get so hung up on methods and instead try to remind ourselves that what we're really interested in are the substantive issues.
Professor Kurzman, besides this new really exciting development that you identified in comparative historical research, there is another development that has been going on in the recent years in comparative historical sociology is increasing academic attention being paid to colonialism and imperialism and its ongoing effects as we see being manifested in different parts of the world today. These trans-regional phenomenon definitely captivated the interest of a lot of comparative historical sociologists today. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your observation of this recent development in comparative historical sociology, and how do you envision the relationship between these two new developments that are happening simultaneously in this field?
Thank you, Claire. I think you've put your finger right on this crucial change that we're in the middle of within the field of comparative historical sociology, or two changes. And this, just to repeat, one of the changes is this re-investigation of methods, of what are the appropriate ways of going about studying things in case-based social science. And the second movement, I would say, exciting new movement within comparative historical sociology is, as you've just mentioned, renewed attention to the long-term global effects of colonialism and imperialism on a global scale. Effects not just on the colonized territories and peoples, but also the effects on the metropoles, the colonizers, and more broadly on the institutions that everybody lives in. These days. These two movements, one sort of a methodological reflexivity, and the other this global turn towards global structures of inequality, focusing on imperialism and colonialism, they came from very different constituencies within comparative historical sociology. What I'm seeing is that these two movements seem to be coming together, and that is, I think, thrilling. Where the methodological reflexivity is now being applied to these broad issues of global concern. And the folks who are interested in these global issues are also starting to contribute to our methodological thinking. And it seems to me that not to foreclose other issues or other approaches, but that these two movements could be extremely powerful with one another, bringing in new scales and topics for analysis, and then new ways of thinking about how do we go and study those things? How do we convince people that something happened the way we think it happened? I'm optimistic that this field is opening up to both new topics and also to new constituencies, new folks in the social sciences, and bringing people into comparative historical work who didn't give it much thought in the past, either because they thought it wasn't relevant to their topics, because there are a handful of themes that seem to be dominating the field, and they now realize that other themes can be studied also through comparative historical approaches. Even, I hope, folks who do quantitative and other sorts of work who I think are coming to realize that there are limits to quantitative data. And if they want to go after certain big questions, they need to supplement the data that they're used to with new forms of evidence. This question of when quantitative social scientists give examples or offer case studies, as they often do, I think comparative historical sociology has something to teach about how they choose the examples that they give and how they present them and what kind of research goes into that. So you shouldn't just be picking the examples that match your regression line perfectly. I think that there's something to teach about looking for examples that are off of the regression line, that are disconfirming perhaps of their overall arguments so that you can learn from those. In other words, I think comparative historical approaches, case-based approaches, have something to teach all of social science and to have people be more reflexive and more thoughtful about how they deal with cases, even when those cases are merely illustrative from their perspective of a broader phenomena that they're approaching on a mass scale through statistical analysis. I feel like I've gone on quite a bit here, but as you can see, I get excited about these topics. I find them really interesting. I'm really heartened by the new generation of graduate students, such as yourselves, and recent graduate students who I think are changing the field very much for the better and forcing old folks like me to race and retool intellectually to catch up. I think that's a wonderful thing for this field, to be challenged and to be broadened by the next generation.
Thank you, Charlie, for joining us for this conversation on the evolving landscape of comparative historical sociology and your hope on future generation of historical sociologists. Stay tuned for more conversations in this podcast series. Until next time.
Goodbye, and thank you both, Katrina and Claire, for including me in this podcast.
Thank you, Professor Kurzman, for being here today. Thanks all for listening, and stay tuned for more conversations.